This is Breaking Down Security, and I am Brian Brake. Welcome back, listener. This is Brian and Mr. Vetcher for Breaking Down Security.
Hey.
I'm so excited. How are you, Mr. Vetcher?
What's going on?
I did some upgrades last week, so, we had a whole big mess last week with the Hangouts, and it was about 150 degrees in my office, but I've got some audio upgrades, which I hope work. I hope we're recording all this just properly. Onward and upward, trying to make it so I don't have to use two computers, make it easier to travel, that kind of thing. So,
and you'll be in a fancy studio before too long.
No. I don't make that much money. I was trying to figure out a way to make it easier for us to record when we go to DerbyCon, because I'd like to actually get a table or get some kind of meetup where everybody can sit around and talk about something, not just like we did with all the podcasters, but like people who are interested in talking about some of the talks, that kind of thing. Maybe do like a roundtable discussion if possible. I'm just trying to think a little bigger than what we did last year. So, but yeah. So, how you been this week, Mr. Fletcher? What's been going on with you?
Oh, fighting hackers.
Oh,
that's
yeah.
That's all we do, right? As blue teamers, try to improve, kick them out, detect them, improve our defenses, that kind of thing. So yeah, been working hard.
Very cool. Were you trying to do a segue there, because it actually works? I mean, you talking about kicking people out and understanding those things.
Yeah.
It goes to our series of rejected talks that we were doing. This is our second rejected talk. Last week we had, I forget his name. What was his name? God, I'm such an awful person. Oh, what is his name? Oh, God. Bill. That's right, Bill Vokes, at Blue Teamer. That's right. I couldn't remember his last name because we actually didn't use his last name. I had to hunt it up. Bill Vokes, I think his name was, at Blue Teamer. Give a great talk on privileged access workstations. So this week, and you can actually hear his talk at DerbyCon because he got accepted. So you can hear more about what privileged access workstations are. So this week we have, damn it all. I'm just Sean Malone. Sean Malone. Hello, Sean Malone. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
If we didn't have something going wrong on the podcast, it just wouldn't be a good podcast. That's all it is. So, Sean, welcome to the show. Thank you for bringing us your partially rejected talk. You did have it accepted at one of the major cons, but not at another one, right?
That's correct. So this was one of those talks where, like many different people, I said, you know what, let's go with the shotgun approach, and we'll submit it to Black Hat, DEF CON, and B-Sides. If you're going to be in Vegas anyways, may as well share it with as many people as possible.
Right on.
As it turns out, it was accepted at Black Hat, and I gave the presentation there. It was rejected for both DEF CON and B-Sides. So I figured, you know what, I'll just kick it over to you and see if it qualifies.
Very cool. So, you were in like one of the main stages where people had to pay a lot of money to go see you talk, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you notice that maybe the rooms weren't as big as they could? Were the rooms, was it full in your talk? I'm not trying to say that the popularity of the talk, but $2,200 or $2,000 plus is a lot of money for a full ticket at Black Hat. Did you see that there was a lot of people there that they were actually paying that kind of money, or not?
It was a pretty full room, cool. And it was a fairly large room as well. So it was well attended. Had some great questions and conversations coming out of the presentation. You're right though. It's not quite the same level of massive crowds that you get at DEF CON when the tickets are a tenth of the price.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. I was just wondering because I'd heard more than one person, at least here in the Seattle area, that attended CSEC East, which is our city get together. That they were, it was some of the talks weren't as well attended. So that's cool. I'm glad yours was well attended. So We got off a little
I
bit
think
there.
they probably make the rooms massive. That way, as many people can go in as possible. But if everybody grabbed a seat, they might be, half or three quarters full,
Maybe.
right?
Maybe.
And so maybe they just made them extra big because they could.
Yeah. Well, the
right?
format will be different next year. The seats and the rooms and everything will be different because they're over at the Caesars next year. So that'll be interesting.
That's DEF CON.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Black Hat actually came from Caesars.
Yeah, that's right.
They were there formerly before moving over to Mandalay.
Okay. Very cool. So, Sean, could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself? Introduce us. What's your superhero origin story? How'd you get into InfoSec? That kind of thing.
Sure. So I've been doing information security of one form or another for the last 10 years or so. I started off in web application development as a hobby back in middle school and high school, and then realized at a certain point that I enjoyed breaking them more than I enjoyed building them. So that got me into application security, moved from that into penetration testing, primarily focused on applications, and then just continued to broaden the scope outwards from there to penetration testing organizations as a whole, and then gradually upping my game to the point of doing red team and true adversary simulations with FusionX. And that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years or so at this point.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Okay. So the subject of your partially rejected talk was all about the using an expanded cyber kill chain model to increase attack resiliency. Maybe you could, for those of us who aren't savvy with what that is, could you tell us a little bit about what a cyber kill chain is, like the definition?
Sure. So to step back even further than that, the kill chain is a concept that's been around for a while, even in the physical, the kinetic realm, as applies to military operations. What's the process that an operation goes through in order to achieve an objective? And for a while now, this concept has been applied to cyber attacks as well, though it was recently popularized by Lockheed Martin in their cyber kill chain, where they took it and turned it into a capitalized cyber kill chain model and put a lot of marketing around this and defined what they consider to be the 7 key steps that the adversary goes through. Okay. And the challenge with this, or actually, but before I get into the challenges there, the 7 steps that they go through are reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and actions on objectives. So as an adversary is going through steps 1 through 6, their reconnaissance through command and control, it's all about breaching the perimeter and establishing a point of presence on the internal network. Usually it's in a compromised workstation, but it could also be coming in through a third-party or vendor connection, or physically walking in and plugging something into the network. However that delivery, exploitation, and installation happens, it's all about getting command and control, stage 6, access to the internal network. Okay. And that then moves into stage 7, which Lockheed describes as, with hands-on keyboard access, intruders accomplish their original goal. And that's not incorrect, but it's also a oversimplification of what the adversary is doing on the internal network. And so there had been many different individuals in the security community who called this out for its focus on the network perimeter, where it has actions on objectives, but really doesn't go into any detail on that. And there was an article from Dark Reading in 2014 called Deconstructing the Cyber Kill Chain, which commented on this and said that the cyber kill chain model, as sexy as it is, reinforces old school perimeter-focused malware prevention thinking. And that really gets at the key of the challenge there, is that with this legacy model, it's all about preventing the adversary from getting to stage 7. And it encourages almost a game over mentality of, once the adversary gets to stage 7, actions are on objectives, are we just going to declare game over because they've reached the end of the kill chain?
Mm.
And so the purpose of the expanded cyber kill chain is to say, no, we can keep fighting. The game's not over here. Even once they get to actions on objectives, they still need to go through additional steps. So let's build an expanded model incorporating those steps so that the blue team can understand what the adversary's doing and increase their likelihood of preventing a perimeter breach from turning into a materially damaging breach of the organization.
Okay. So it's not just fancy, like cyber kill chain is just not fancy marketing or anything like that. There's actually a method to the madness. It's the method by which the attacker is going to attack your network. And
right. It's definitely based on research into real-world attacks from the incident response and analysis side of things. But it's also based on the experience of the red team member who's gone through these types of attack simulations, like what I've been doing for the last 4 years with FusionX. Both I and others on my team, we've attacked a lot of organizations. We have a good feel for how this normally goes when you're operating from a hyper-realistic perspective, meaning the blue team doesn't know that they're under attack. You have a particular objective that you're looking to achieve. So it goes beyond the penetration testing of just looking to gain access. And so from that perspective, we see a lot of the same patterns and the same sequence of steps emerge again and again.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about actions on objectives. Maybe you could give us an example of what an objective is. I mean, is it a goal, or is it just something you just want to do inside the network to gain a foothold or what have you?
Sure. So every real-world adversary is going to have a motivation. What is it that gets them to attack an organization? For some, it may be a financial motivation. For others, it's ideological. For others, it's look at Anonymous, look at LulzSec. Some are just doing it for the lulz. They're doing it for their own reputation. They're doing it because it's fun. But whatever it is, they're going to have a motivation. And whether it's getting money, increasing their own prestige, whatever it is, they have objectives that are in line with their motivations. So under financial theft, they may be looking to modify queued wire transfers and redirect payments. We saw this with the hack of the Bank of Bangladesh, where it was close to $100 million that was stolen at the end of the day. We see this with the attacks against the Ukraine power grid. And then also, even more recently, for the coup attempt in Turkey. That provides a very strong motivation to hijack a television broadcast and be able to broadcast your own propaganda, your own version of what's happening on the ground that fits the message that you're looking to get out. So all of these different types of objectives are what we mean by actions on objectives, and what leads to the creation of the internal kill chain and the target manipulation kill chain. Okay. So it really goes beyond simply technical objectives of now I can log into this system or now I'm a domain administrator, and looking at the business level objectives from the adversary's perspective. Okay.
Mr. Betcher, do you have any questions?
In the installation, it says installing malware on the asset. It doesn't really have to be malware, right? It can be just getting admin user, right? And being able to troll through a network because you've stolen a VPN account, right?
That is correct. So several comments on that. First, everything in the legacy cyber kill chain comes directly from Lockheed Martin. So that's something where I can't take any credit, nor did I want to change what they had sort of put out there and established as the standard cyber kill chain. That said, any model is going to be generalized. So it's not always going to occur exactly as stated there. And I agree that installing malware may not actually be required if you can do something like hijack a VPN account or plant your own device on the internal network.
Okay, so I'm looking at the was it slide 8, and you're talking about the expanded kill chain, which is a model you guys have kind of developed over the last few years.
Right. So this is a model that I developed, which essentially takes the legacy cyber kill chain and continues to build on it. It takes the final stage 7, actions on objectives, and first explodes that into the internal kill chain, which includes internal reconnaissance, internal exploitation, enterprise privilege escalation, lateral movement, and target manipulation to achieve an objective. And then we take it one step further and explode that final stage of the internal kill chain, target manipulation, into its own target manipulation kill chain. Mm-hmm. Because even once the adversary gets access to the target systems, they still go through this additional process to first conduct target reconnaissance, exploit the particular target, weaponize malware specific to achieving their objective. So in this case, we're not talking about malware that provides command and control access, but rather perhaps malware that redirects wire transfers or manipulates a industrial control system environment. They then need to install that malware on the target systems and finally execute at a point that is advantageous to them.
Okay. And this could be simply a script that exfils data, right, at a slow rate.
Correct.
Or something like that.
Correct.
That's what we mean by malware. It's just malicious software. It can be any type of executable running or any command.
Right. It could be as simple as a single command. It could be a more complex script. It could be a modified binary or backdoored firmware. There was one case where we were attacking an industrial control system, and we wrote a modified piece of firmware that would disconnect what was being reported back to the centralized control station from what was actually going on in the field. So not only could we then change the outputs of this control system, but we also blinded the individuals in the control center so everything would look like it was okay. So that's what we're talking about in the target manipulation kill chain, and that one is highly objective specific. Okay. It's going to depend very closely on what your objective is to determine what the steps you go through at that point will be.
Well, it's almost like when you get to the target manipulation, you're almost repeating the legacy kill chain over again, because you have to do reconnaissance just like you do in the cyber kill chain. You have to do exploitation. You have to install some kind of software on that box specifically. Is it just like with target manipulation? Is that for like specific systems? Like you get on a regular Windows box, you could probably just do the legacy kill chain. But for target manipulation, you'd want to do like for specialized systems like maybe a mainframe or control systems, that kind of thing. Is this more of a specialized systems like what do they call that for the banking, the financial system? Was that started with an S? It was like their financial trading.
The Swift system.
Swift system, yeah. Would the Swift system be like where you would want to use something like the target manipulation kill chain?
Exactly, and that observation that you just made is completely correct. And what led into sort of comparing and contrasting this with different models that can be used, because it is the same steps in a different context. Mm-hmm. The process of weaponization, installation, and so on is going to be different, but it is the same type of step again. What this is recognizing or attempting to highlight is that the adversary should need to go through steps on the internal network that are at least as difficult as the steps that they took to get onto the internal network in the first place. Mm-hmm. So when an organization is properly architected from a security perspective, and they have a very low level of trust in their internal network, they operate under the presumption that it will be breached at some point, that means that they're going to define additional security zones, monitor and control access between security zones, monitor and control access to particular high-value hosts that might be targeted for that target manipulation kill chain. And there are so many different controls that go into that, but it's all about identifying when an adversary is moving through these steps, even on the internal or target manipulation kill chain, and having that visibility and the understanding that they will need to go through all of these additional steps.
Okay. I'm seeing a lot of on the internal kill chain and the cyber and the target manipulation. I'm seeing a lot of. We did a podcast a long time ago, almost 6 months ago, about the attack matrix from MITRE. Was any of this inspired by the attack matrix from MITRE, or was this just two great groups of people coming up with the same idea, or
It was actually entirely in separate but parallel tracks, in that we're looking to get to a similar understanding of what's going on.
Okay.
But we're approaching it from slightly different perspectives. I've reviewed the work that they've done, and from my perspective, it's great and very valuable. Mine is focused on it's less on the specific techniques that are being used in terms of the specific technical attacks, and more on what's the grand scale objective and how is the adversary progressing to that objective.
All right. Okay. All right.
Sean, let's talk about reconnaissance here. We've all heard about the external reconnaissance, right? We learned that in the pen testing classes and everything. Now, internal reconnaissance. An attacker, well, first of all, a defender would have to be able to detect internal reconnaissance. Somebody scans the network, an alert should go off, right? From an attacker's perspective, how careful does one have to be on internal reconnaissance, and talk about some methods that one might use, and then how to detect those methods?
Sure. So when we say internal reconnaissance, we're usually not talking about scanning, because any adversary who is of a sophistication level that we're really concerned about here is not going to be scanning once they have access to the internal network.
Yeah, it's a low bar.
Right. And so in this case, the reconnaissance takes a different form. It's first conducting the DOMEX, document and media exploitation, of the initial foothold, the compromised workstation that they have access to in most cases, if there's been a successful phishing attack or a drive-by download, whatever it is. So I have access to this workstation. Every packet that I send out onto the network increases my likelihood of being detected. What can I learn before I start sending additional packets? So we look at what is their email, what can we learn about the organization, and who they communicate with, what their role is, what the different business units are. We look at their web browsing history. What internal sites have they accessed in the course of their day-to-day job? Is there an internal portal, SharePoint, Wiki? What is the knowledge repository for this organization? What file shares do they have access to? Now we're starting to branch out beyond the local host, but still in very normal patterns. What file shares do they have access to? What do they normally access on those shares? And can we find additional information in the file shares, keys, SharePoints, that allows us to progress to the next step? What far more often than this should happen, the next step can simply be finding credentials that were left on an internal SharePoint site and using that to move to the next step without ever doing a port scan. Yeah. If we are ever going to be probing for open ports and services, it's not in the normal sort of port scan, but more perhaps we're looking across these 10 hosts to say, do they have a web server running on any of the 5 most common web server ports? And in that case, it's not a problem if we send one packet every 10 seconds because we're looking at a very small number of ports total. So the reconnaissance does take a very different form, which means that it's a very different type of technique that would be used to detect and respond to that.
Now you say sending packets one every 10 seconds. What about honeypots? I mean, how often, if you use this internal reconnaissance, how often do attackers fall for these honeypots and how do they avoid them?
I have yet to see our team actually get detected through the use of a honeypot.
Okay, what percentage of your clients use honeypots?
I don't know. We actually don't often have a lot of visibility into the preventative and detective controls that are in place, in large part because we conduct these from a double-blind perspective. I mentioned the zero notice component. The security team is not aware of our operations. At the same time, we're not briefed ahead of time on what the organization has in place that might trip us up. We're looking for this to be as realistic as possible. I can think of maybe 2 or 3 organizations that had honeypots deployed in particular areas of the network during the attack that we learned about after the fact. The challenge with a honeypot is that especially in an organization, a large corporation such as the ones that we're usually attacking, they're going to have hundreds of thousands of systems on their internal network. Even if there were 100 honeypots that they had deployed, it's highly likely that we would go through this exercise and just accidentally not even stumble across one of them, much less target it in any particular sense.
Yeah, it kind of has to scale. If you've got 10,000 hosts, you kind of need to have so many percentage actually being fake, which kind of defeats the purpose if you're running in a cloud-based environment. That 1,000 fake non-using assets is going to take up a ton of your money. So having 3 hosts and 10,000 not going to make a lot of difference.
There are some interesting ideas around that, though, that are not so much honeypot hosts, but different types of assets. So honeypot local administrator accounts, where if you have a local administrator account or even a domain account that is deliberately put into every system but doesn't actually work to log into anything, what that means is that an adversary who sees that grabs that account and tries to use it, either cracking it or passing the hash, whatever it is. That gives you something very, very specific to drill down on in your logs. So you can go to whatever your log correlation engine is and say, show me everything that happens with this account, even the failed attempts. And you know that account should never be used on a normal basis, and that looking to use that account to migrate to new systems is likely to be in the playbook of most adversaries. So there are, I'll call them honeypot concepts as opposed to honeypot hosts that can be more effective. And we're seeing that discussed more, but we haven't yet seen our team get tripped up by that.
Yeah. The fake or the leaving artifacts around fake documents, those kinds of things, and putting traps on them so that if they've been accessed, one, is it being accessed by somebody who's just curious or is it somebody who's being malicious? You can find that stuff out really quickly.
Right, and those types of items often scale much more easily.
Okay.
Are there any procedures to recon post-exploit the patient 0 to see what the capabilities are on that host? Like, do they have proper logging enabled? Do they have a forwarder on box? Things like that.
Yes, and that's absolutely one of the first things that we'll do. When we get on a host, there are 2 priorities. One, get persistence in a covert manner so that if our connection dies for some reason or another, we have a way to get back in. We have something in place that will phone back home and provide us with our access again. And then only closely behind, or just barely behind that in terms of priority, is understand what are the controls on this box. What is it that we need to be careful of as we proceed further? So do they have particular antivirus or anti-malware solutions? What logging is enabled? Where are those logs sent? All of those items are going to be critical elements of determining the next path forward.
Okay. Speaking of the cyber kill chain, on slide 10 you have OODA, which a lot of military people understand. Is this just another thing that's moved into civilian world as well? I mean, we do borrow a lot of military terms, and bring them in. I don't know if it's marketing or what, or if a lot of people are just ex-military, but could you maybe explain what the OODA loop is?
Sure. So first, I think it's completely correct. We are seeing a lot that's brought over from the military world into cybersecurity, because as this continues to be essentially a new domain of war, a lot of the same concepts apply. We only need to look at the current United States election and all of the political intrigue around who's hacking whom and does that actually have an impact on the election cycle to understand that this is significant. Mm-hmm. It's politically significant, and it has implications for warfare, for operations in the kinetic realm as well. Sure. And so the cross-pollination goes both directions there. So for the OODA loop specifically, this is one that comes from the world of a fighter pilot. When there's a fighter pilot in their Air Force jet in a dogfight, and they're going through this process of trying to observe a situation, orient themselves to that situation, decide what their best course of action is, and then act on that information. That's a very similar process to what an adversary is going through as they keep getting more information and more access to the environment. Mm. So observe, orient, decide, act. That's the OODA loop from the fighter pilot training. And the concept is, if the fighter pilot can go through this loop more thoroughly and more quickly than their adversary, they have the upper hand. They can make correct actions more quickly than the adversary can. In addition to that, if you can disrupt the adversary's OODA loop, because the enemy fighter pilot is making this same loop, whether or not they think of it in these terms, if you can disrupt that by feeding false information into their observation or just disrupting something in their orientation process so they have to go back to observing, whatever it is, you can slow them down. Okay. So this is an alternative model, alternative to the kill chain, because one of the criticisms of the kill chain is that it really is the same steps again and again and again, as you called out. And so when you look at it from the OODA loop perspective, the adversary may go through an OODA loop in order to get access to the internal network. Once they're on a workstation, they go back to observing. That's the type of reconnaissance that we were talking about. And they go through that process, orient, decide, act again. And they may go through that process in order to then get access to their first server on the network. And then go through that process to go from server access to, now I have a enterprise service account that lets me log in anywhere. Now I have access to much more information, time to observe and orient again. And they go through this process to the point where they can access the systems that they care about, the target systems, and then observe, orient, decide, and act in order to manipulate the target systems. So from one perspective, it's a loop. At the same time, it's more of this linear kill chain model, because as the adversary goes through each loop, they're moving closer and closer to their goal. So one alternative method is to say, well, let's combine a line and a circle with the OODA loop and the kill chain and say it's a spiral. The adversary goes through these different stages of reconnaissance, exploitation, escalation, and lateral movement, but at the same time, they're drilling in further and further to get to their end target.
Okay. Yeah, now it makes sense, because I'm like, well, how does the circle make it? But yeah, as you get closer and closer and closer down in, then yeah, you're continuing with the loop. But yeah, that's very interesting. It's very nice graphic. So yeah, it makes perfect sense actually.
But then yet another challenge to even the spiral model is that seems to imply that there's one correct path that the adversary goes through, and anyone who's done any sort of offensive security engagement knows that there's never one path. There are often multiple paths that might work, and there are certainly multiple false starts along the way, where you look to get to the next step and you try this technique, that technique. Some of them will work, some of them won't. And so yet another alternative is the tree model, where you start at a particular origin point and you spider out from that point. It's almost like a lightning strike, where the lightning starts up high in the sky and works its way down to the ground, reaching out feelers to the point where it hits the ground, and then what actually lights up is the return path going across the final path there and discharging the built-up energy. So it's somewhat similar in this case, in that often the adversary is branching out in multiple directions, going through this process as they get from one stage to the next, and there will be false starts along the way. So the point of considering all of these different models is to say there's not one right way to think about this. One model is not always going to be better than the other ways that this can be considered and visualized. It's all in what is it that you're looking to get out of this model? Who's the audience that you're speaking with, that you're trying to educate around this process? And what is it that you're hoping that they learn from this? And what model is then going to be the most useful in that particular situation? Yep. For the expanded kill chain, even though it doesn't fully incorporate the alternative spiral model or the tree model, it does represent that the adversary is going through this process to get sequentially further and further towards the point where they can achieve their objective. And they go through these high-level stages as they move closer and closer to that point. So that's the reason why I decided to focus on expanding the cyber kill chain model while recognizing the validity of these others as well.
Sure. Okay, so you were talking about the OODA loop, and you said that one fighter pilot uses the OODA loop, and you've got the other guy. We'll call it red team and blue team. So you got the red guy using his OODA loop. At what point in the red team's OODA loop does the blue team start using their OODA loop? Because it seems to me you can't both observe at the same time. You both can't orient at the same time. You can't decide at the same time. The blue team only can act once the red team's OODA loop has gone through and the red team has actually acted. So, I mean, does that mean that the blue team is always 3 steps behind in the OODA loop?
I think they can be observing each other at the same time. So before they enter into this conflict, the adversary may be conducting open source intelligence to understand their target. They may not send a single packet against their target's infrastructure, but nonetheless, they're learning about their target. They're looking at domains, IP registries, email addresses, social media profiles of employees, all of this type of information. So that's observing what's out there. At the same time, on the blue team side, they have threat intelligence about what are the existing threat actors in the world that we should be concerned about. What are their common tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're going to employ against us? So there is some observation that occurs at that point. Once they actually enter into this engagement, there are some items that can't be easily observed, such as weaponization. If the adversary is weaponizing something in their lab, the blue team likely won't know about that unless you're sort of at the NSA level and have your feelers out and in these different organizations to have the intel about what's going on there. But for most organizations, they won't see that. Once the adversary starts attacking the network, the purpose of the blue team's model and their mindset should be, how much can we observe and orient ourselves correctly to so that we can look at this and decide, you know what, this is an indicator that we are under attack, and then act appropriately on it. So early detection, unsurprisingly, is going to be a key part of that.
Sean, let's talk briefly a little bit about each step in the internal kill chain. Kind of go over what's different about each one.
Sure.
So we talked about internal reconnaissance, right? What about internal exploitation? What's different?
Right. So for just to by way of contrast, external exploitation would be what is it that we can exploit on the target systems in order to get access to the internal network. For internal exploitation, we now have access to the internal network. We've done the reconnaissance. Our reconnaissance has likely identified vulnerabilities or information. So this may be a set of credentials, or it may be noticing that there is a application vulnerability over here. Over in this corner, there's a development server that's running Tomcat with a username of admin and a password of admin. All of these types of things would be likely to turn up under internal reconnaissance. So then internal exploitation is taking that next step of exploiting the information and the vulnerabilities on these internal systems to gain access to systems outside of that patient zero that you used in the breach of the internal network.
Very cool. Yeah. So that requires what? The internal exploitation would require what? Like what kind of tools would we be talking about for that kind of thing? Would things in Kali Linux be good, or are we looking at custom tools, or maybe checking out DNS or not DNS, but just doing version strings, that kind of thing? Are we looking at banner grabs and that kind of stuff?
All of the above, depending on the particular environment and where it looks like there's blood in the water. So if we can identify the Tomcat server, for example, and we're able to log in there, then we have the ability to upload a web application archive file that can give us a web application backdoor onto that server. And as we go through that process, we'll be writing custom code, building it into the correct package in order to load onto that server. There are definitely modules for this in Metasploit and other frameworks, but anything that has been released publicly may well have a signature for it. And so the adversary is going to want to avoid that when possible. So if we can put together a few lines of code that gives us a basic backdoor onto a system and lets us move to the next stage, to us that's preferable, even if it requires a little bit of extra time to do that, since it decreases the likelihood of detection when we move through that stage.
Cool.
So you're also looking for other backdoors, right? In case you lose the one you have.
That's correct. So when we spider out through an organization and access these other systems, we'll look to establish additional points of presence so that when our primary workstation goes offline, whether it's because it's detected and pulled off the network to be analyzed and reimaged, or simply we were on a laptop and somebody closes it up and goes home for the day. We want to have multiple additional points of presence on the network so that we can continue the operation, even if our initial ones are removed.
So why does the internal kill chain take so long to do? You're talking about internal recon taking 1 to 2+ weeks, internal exploitation taking 2 whole days, PrivEsc 1 to 3 days. I mean, why does it take so long for that? Is that because you have to move slowly, or is it because it really takes that long to actually find that niche in the armor, or that chink in the armor?
So this is due to the low and slow approach. So this is not the timeline that you would likely see in a penetration test. Most penetration tests these days are more smash and grab style. You're coming in, you're getting the level of access and stealing that flag as quickly as possible, and it doesn't matter if somebody hears the glass break along the way.
Right.
it doesn't matter if the alarm goes off because you're not really looking to evaluate their overall capability to detect and respond.
Okay.
They may be looking to see, okay, yes, we saw when you were scanning, we saw when you ran this utility, but that doesn't really answer the question if we were going to be attacked by a truly sophisticated adversary who's looking to remain undetected. Can we do that? Can we detect and respond effectively? So this is looking at it from that perspective, because when these major breaches occur, it's usually not that the adversary got in and achieved their end objective within a few days.
Yeah.
Usually it's that the organization was breached for a matter of months, and they didn't find it.
Yeah, I think
so this is what we see in the wild.
I think the Verizon data breach report every year, they say the average is anywhere between 15 to 22 months or something like that, where they just sit in there and once they gain access, they don't do anything because they just bide their time because they want to make sure that, maybe they caused a little bump in activity where somebody was starting to look at something, then they go quiet. They want to lay low until the heat's off, in the vernacular, criminal, but and then they move along once the suspicion is gone.
Right.
So that makes sense. Okay, that I understand. Right on. So lateral movement. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how lateral movement works with regard to once they've gotten access to it. I assume all of this internal stuff is after they already have a foothold, after they're already inside the system. They're just trying to move and spider out to the other systems.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the next two stages here are enterprise privilege escalation and lateral movement.
Mm-hmm.
And the enterprise privilege escalation, this is taking the same concept of privilege escalation of going from a normal user account to a root or system level account and having that full level of control and scaling it up. So it's great to have root access to a system. It's better to have root access to an entire corporation.
Okay.
So that's what we're looking to do here is gain access to the service accounts, the unprotected SSH keys, other types of vulnerabilities in core authentication systems such as Active Directory, generating those golden Kerberos tickets and so on that give us this very high level of privilege and the ability to log into many different systems. So that'll be key then when we get to the next step of lateral movement. Lateral movement should be, so if our enterprise privilege escalation has been very effective, then our lateral movement is more about pivoting than exploitation. We already have the access to these systems. Now it's more about finding the systems that we care about. So if we're targeting money movement and looking to initiate a wire transfer and move money out of a financial institution, where are those wire transfer systems that are the last step before it goes out to the SWIFT system, so that we can manipulate a wire transfer queued on that system? In order to do that, we need to move laterally from our initial point to that system. That should be a fairly difficult task, requiring going through several different pivot hosts and security zones of increasing levels, increasing classifications of security. But usually it's using those service accounts and SSH keys and so on that have already been compromised in the earlier phases. And all of that then builds together to getting access to the target systems that we really care about and then being able to move into the target manipulation kill chain.
Okay. So the lateral movement, you mentioned defensive tactics, and one of them is segmenting security zones at all layers. This sounds a lot like the use of like privileged access workstations would go a long way to preventing lateral movement in a network.
Yes. So all too often, when people think of segmentation or security zones, they're thinking of only network segmentation. But you can take it a lot further than that. And if you look at it from the perspective of what if we assume that somebody's on the internal network and has access to any given set of credentials, how do we design our architecture to withstand that?
Yeah.
So then you're looking at not just having multiple network zones, but having multiple Active Directory domains based on the security level and getting more granular with that. Having different virtualization systems, having different backup systems. We've seen cases where theoretically there are security zones in place, but they all the backups from those servers all go to the same backup system that is accessible from a low security zone. Okay. It's one set of credentials away from accessing the backups of a high security system. Same thing with virtualization. Too often there's a VMware console or similar that gives you access to all of these systems of differing security levels, and that console only requires the single factor of authentication in the username and password. So it's by looking at all of these different layers and saying, how can we segment these security zones and make it as difficult as possible for an attacker to move from one to the other?
Okay. All right, so you've done all your due diligence. You're running on the inside of the network. You've got numerous points of access. You've gained persistence in this case. You've done what is necessary. Now you're needing to hit that Swift terminal or that DAM control system or whatever. How would you go about? You're talking about 1 week to 3 months of target reconnaissance. I'm assuming you're also doing more external reconnaissance because companies will leave the how-to manuals on their website or something. Are you also looking inside for any documentation, or is this more along the lines of trying to find the PDF on somebody's desktop? What are we looking for when we're talking about target reconnaissance specifically?
All of the above. So this is really mapping and understanding the objective-specific systems. So the systems that we can now access, or we can at least access the network segment that they're on, and we can then query these devices and say, what make and model of device are they using here? What's the software package that they're using? And then the reason why it takes 1 week to 3 months is that there's then a learning process that goes into understanding this platform. If we were looking to simply turn off their systems, that can be done very quickly. There's not much understanding required. But if we're looking to be able to subvert their controls in a way that allows us to modify the systems or the data in those systems and do it in a way that lets us accomplish our objective before they detect that we've modified something, that requires a much deeper level of understanding, not just of how to make that modification, but how to do it in a way that's not detected.
Okay.
So, yes, it involves looking at the systems themselves, looking at available documentation from the vendor of those systems, even to the extent of setting up a shell company and seeking a proof of concept from that vendor. Yep. Have someone from the vendor teach you about their systems so that you can then go exploit them. And then also going back to the internal reconnaissance, as we've gone through this reconnaissance process, we have now knowledge of where their internal knowledge repositories are. So we can go out to their corporate intranet search site and go search for the particular make and model and often turn up documentation there. We may go to the workstations of the systems administrators who are responsible for configuring and maintaining these systems and look at what documentation they may have lying around on their workstations. So it really is, where can we go? How much information can we get in order to really understand what we're looking at here and be able to move into the next stage of target exploitation?
I guess other forms of reconnaissance would be like maybe even getting a job at the company of the, or talking to technicians who work on those things, invite one out for a beer or something, gain a rapport with somebody who works internally at either the company or the organization you're trying to hack.
Or put out a job posting seeking particular skills in that area with a high but just low enough to be believable compensation level to attract the interest of an administrator working on these and get them to tell you all about the experience they have on these systems.
Reverse job interviews.
Right, and I mean, we've done this in the case of particular hardware that was necessary in order to print a given financial instrument pertinent to the target corporation that we were attacking, and it involved calling the vendor and saying, I'm looking into the security of the software, and I'd like to get access to the utilities necessary to run this printer that I got from a surplus shop. And something as simple as building that rapport and saying, hey, can you help me out here?
Very nice, very nice. Okay, so once you've done all that, you then drop from 1 week to 3 months to target exploiting in only an hour. Because I assume at that point you've either gained enough information to be able to hack it, or you found that they've backdoored, they put backdoor credentials in there, because some firmware does do that.
Right. So exploitation is the process of actually gaining access to the target systems.
Yeah. Okay.
So at that point, usually there's a trust relationship between systems that we've already compromised and the target systems that we care about. So if we already have access to the credentials for a system administrator authorized to log in because we've compromised the Active Directory domain, we'll then simply use those credentials. So exploitation may be as simple as logging in as an authorized user. It may also be default credentials that were left in place on an industrial control system. But it usually is a very quick process if the enterprise escalation and the lateral movement have been done properly.
Very cool.
And it may be changing source code on the next build, right?
Yep.
Very nice. So weaponization, that's just... So if you've already got access to the box, what do you need to weaponize a payload for? Is that just to change the function of the device, very much like Stuxnet was doing, where they changed a piece of source code and made it,
This is writing Stuxnet, or whatever the equivalent is for your objective. It may be writing a script to modify the destination accounts on wire transfers. It may be writing a script to push out malware to all of a user's workstations to brick those systems and make them inoperable. It's going to depend highly on whatever the objective is, but it's all about being able to develop that platform-specific malware. We have the access. Now we're looking to subvert and manipulate those target systems and business processes.
Okay. Like on Office Space, where they took the code and they took all the little fractions of pieces that were left. He had to add the code to the system to take all those little fractions of pieces and move it off to another bank account.
Right. Or in Mr. Robot, when they're looking to overheat all of the backups. They have the access that they get. They have the Raspberry Pi that's been planted, and now we need to actually deploy or to weaponize this to build the malware that's going to control the thermostats and cause the backup centers to overheat.
Very cool. Okay. So after obviously it takes time to reverse engineer that. I would assume the weaponization would come from the reconnaissance if you could gain access to source controller binaries that you could reverse engineer. At that point, using what you got during reconnaissance actually is helpful in the weaponization and installation of the software itself.
Right. So this is usually done in a lab environment. So we're looking to duplicate the target environment, go out and purchase surplus equipment, or like I mentioned, the proof of concept, whatever it is, to be able to have a environment that mimics what we see in our target's production environment, so that we can extract and decompile firmware, reverse engineer it, and patch it, or create scripts that interface with it in a way that will achieve the objective. Once we have that in place, the installation, again, is very straightforward. We already have the access. We have a weaponized piece of malware, and the installation is simply deploying that malware to the target systems.
All right. Very cool. Yeah. So once you've installed it, it only takes a second to do execution. I guess at that point, is execution more of a trial and error? I mean, will you go through weaponization, installation, execution more than once if something you've done hasn't worked out? And obviously, it must be quite noisy at that point, right?
If you've done your recon and your weaponization well and have tested it in a target environment, you should have a very high likelihood of execution working on the first try. But yes, if something fails, you'll reset to the target reconnaissance and try to figure out, okay, what failed? What was there something that we missed here? How do we adjust course and give it another go?
Yeah.
The key thing to note about execution, though, is that there may be a long period of time, months even, between installation and execution, depending on what timing the adversary wants. Because the adversary has they're making the decision at this point as to when to pull the trigger. Every day they wait increases the likelihood that they could be detected and eradicated. But if they've gone 6 months without being detected and eradicated, there's a good chance they could go 6 months and a week. And so they have some flexibility here, and we'll time this to align with their broader objective. So it may be particular market conditions if they're looking for financial gain. It may be geopolitical operations, like with what we mentioned with propaganda for a coup attempt. Mm-hmm. You may get to the point where you have the ability to hijack a television broadcast and sit on that for months until you're actually ready to launch this coup, and then push your video out to the television networks at that point.
So there might be sub-objectives. You may be wanting to affect an election in a specific country, or you may want to sell the shares of stock in a company that you have, on both ends. So you're gonna buy when it's, or sell when it's high, and then you're gonna hack it. There'll be a drop in price. You'll buy them again, and you're gonna make profit that way. I mean, there's sub objectives that you may get, like a plan B and a plan C.
That's correct.
Okay. So you have some very good news for all the blue teamers. You say every control will fail. And that's the resilient mindset when you're trying to build a resilient enterprise. So that's quite positive of you, that every control will fail. You even have it in big red letters, and bold big red letters.
It's recognizing the reality of the situation, that any given control by itself is likely to fail at some point.
Okay.
You have a network perimeter. You have email filtering. Perhaps you've deployed a solution to detect when payloads are trying to be sent via email. But there will be something that gets past that. There will be a time when somebody gets command and control access to a workstation. There will be a time when a security guard lets someone in without a badge because they were they're wearing a fast food delivery uniform and bringing pizzas in for the conference room for the executive meeting, and he doesn't want to be the one to prevent the executive team from getting their lunch. So whatever it is, any given control by itself may well fail. And so if you operate from that perspective, if you operate under the presumption that the adversary will at some point have access to the internal network, they'll have access to any given username and password, and they have access to all of the documentation, the network diagrams, all the other specifications about your most important systems, you would likely design your environment rather differently. Then you start looking at robust security zones, having more analysis around user behavior, usage of privileged accounts, deploying two-factor authentication. There are all of these different types of things that really come to your attention when you look at it from the perspective of what could possibly go wrong. And we've seen organizations that we've worked with for the last 5 years or so, where we attack them year over year over year. And they're getting much better. They're getting much harder for us to attack by taking on this mindset and looking at their environment as from the perspective of every control will fail, and does our security architecture overall as an enterprise, account for that eventuality.
It sounds like the
You
assumed
have to
breach
look-
thing.
Correct. That's one piece of it. Assume that your perimeter will be breached, but further than that, assume that the adversary will have a domain administrator account at some point. Yeah. And similarly with every other control.
Yeah, look no further than antivirus, right? It catches a lot of things. I mean, it'll catch Mimikatz, like you mentioned. But there are a lot of things that get by it. So you have to put in extra controls to make up for that deficiency.
That's right. It's looking to build this defense in depth architecture such that you have as many chances as possible to detect and respond before the adversary can achieve their objective.
Yep. Yeah, I like your graphics about changing the economy down here. You were talking about the value of the adversary of the defended asset. We've talked about that before, where you're increasing attacker debt. I mean, you call it return on investment, but you're basically making it so expensive for the attacker to get in, versus by time or by money or just effort, that you're discouraging them from wanting to do it. And that's a psychological thing. If you can get them to the point where, like, it's not even worth attacking because all I'm going to get is just pittance, or it's not worth $5 million if I'm only going to get $3 million worth of IP or assets or ability. If you can ramp it up to where they're spending hundreds of hours trying to get into something, they may just decide it's not worth it at all and move on.
That's right. We want to put a defense in depth model with a control set, broadly speaking, a combination of prevention controls and detection controls in place, such that for most levels of sophistication, it requires longer for the adversary to achieve their objective than it does for the defending team to detect and eradicate that intrusion. This forces the adversary to increase their level of sophistication further and further as it gets harder and harder to attack this organization. And that level of sophistication essentially translates to the level of the adversary's investment. So when we increase the strength of the defenses, we increase the investment required to achieve the objective, which then results in the safe zone where the adversary actually has that negative return on investment that you mentioned. But even if so increasing the defenses also, of course, requires an investment.
Sure.
So it may not always make sense to invest to the point where you're entirely in that safe zone, because you may spend more money than the value to the adversary of the defended asset. But even if you can decrease the adversary's return on investment, even if it's still positive, it's less likely that they will go after you and more likely that they'll go after someone else who's an easier target. So ideally, we'd all be in that safe zone where the adversary has a negative return on investment. But even short of that, there's some truth to the saying that you don't necessarily have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun your companions.
Yeah.
So it's recognizing the reality of the situation there, where we do want to continue to raise the bar for the industry overall. But what you really don't want to do is to be the corporation within your industry for a given type of adversary and a given motivation that the adversary sees as easy pickings where they can have the highest return on investment.
Sure. Yeah. And that's really just matter of knowing what the value of the information or the asset or what your value is to the bad guy. If you don't know that, then you can't, it's hard to justify a $5 million InfoSec budget if you don't know, how valuable your information or your IP is to the black market or to the bad guys. So it really helps to get that kind of valuation, either by purchasing insurance or talking to people who are in the know to find out that information.
Well, and all information is not valued the same even within a given enterprise.
Sure.
And it's why that security zone concept makes sense. And if you can identify the 5% of your assets that you really care about and that have the highest value to you, and increase the defenses around those such that it can withstand compromise of the remaining 95% of your enterprise, that allows you to really focus that security investment and maximize the return on your investment on the defensive side.
Very cool. Yep. Mr. Betcher, do you have any other thoughts or questions on this?
Yeah. What are, Sean, some methods that defenders take that are most effective in catching these sophisticated adversaries, like yourself?
So I'd say that there are the two broad categories of prevention and detection, and it goes hand in hand, where if you can increase the prevention controls, such as the security zones, multi-factor authentication, and so on, make the adversary need to try as hard as possible, which gives your detection controls as many chances as possible at actually triggering and pointing out where the adversary is in the organization. And then on the detective side, anything that relies on a blacklist approach is going to be easier to subvert. So things like more of the traditional antivirus that's signature based and so on, those are pretty darn easy to subvert. Usually it simply requires repacking a given binary or otherwise obfuscating a tool. Mm-hmm. Some of the most difficult things to subvert are the detective controls that are more behavioral based. And this can be either system behavior or user behavior. So in terms of system behavior, if you're not looking for the checksum on the file for the Mimikatz executable, but rather you're looking at how that tool interacts with the system and the types of system calls that it makes, where it connects to, the processes it interacts with, that's going to be a more effective control. It becomes more behavioral and heuristic about what level of confidence. It's not just a 1 or a 0, this is bad or it's not, but this leads me to think this might be worth investigating. And then at the user level, if you can understand how, most importantly, your privileged users operate within your environment and detect deviations from that normal operation, that's the holy grail. That is, and there are lots of different vendors working on this. All of them have the right idea, but it's very difficult to do that with a manageable false positive rate. Mm. Some of it's very simple to describe, such as if an administrator is logging in from a source IP address and then 5 minutes later logs in from another source IP address that is not, say, related to a VPN concentrator or a terminal services server or something like that, but it logs in from two different IP addresses that geographically are spaced 2,000 miles apart, there's a good chance that something odd is going on, and it may be two different people using that same account, and it's worth looking into. Mm-hmm. Or if this given administrator normally logs into these 50 servers to do his job, but today he's logging into 5 systems that he's never touched before over in this other data center, it's not necessarily a red flag, but it's worth assigning someone to pick up the phone and call him and say, John, we noticed that you were logging into these systems, and it's the first time we've seen you log in. What's going on here? Yeah. Was there a need to log into these systems? We just wanted to make sure that this was you and that it was part of your normal job. And if you can get those types of events down to the point where it's a manageable work queue for an individual to go through in the course of their responsibilities, you both have a high likelihood of detecting when an administrative account has been compromised, and it gives you an additional chance to catch an insider threat of an administrator who it was that administrator, but he's acting outside the scope of his authorizations.
Yeah. So if you've got the web, the web admin on, trying to log into the Active Directory server, for instance, the web admin should never and would never have access to the Active Directory. So that would be a red flag, because that's behavior that it shouldn't do. The web admin knows he can't access Active Directory. It's always the network admins. So those are the kinds of things you should look for, and vice versa. The network admins may not need or have access to, web admin accounts and or resources, and those are things you need to look for.
Right, and you can do that with every type of user at every level. In the sense of, why is Mark from the payroll department running a PowerShell script on his computer? This just doesn't make sense. Or this user, maybe you do need to have macros enabled for your Office documents because some users use them. But the finance team is known to use them on a fairly regular basis. But this individual in marketing has never run a macro on his workstation before. But now he does. Why? So again, it's not necessarily that we know immediately that this is bad, but it's all about what are the pointers towards something worth looking into further.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Behavioral analysis is definitely the holy grail. I mean, companies are trying to, create machine learning and tools that will, find those kinds of incidents of compromise. That will, go, okay, why is Bob running macros on his host because he shouldn't be doing that, or we've had PowerShell running on this box that has never ran PowerShell before. So that, those are the kinds of things that machine learning tools and quote unquote artificial intelligence is trying to help with regard to infections and ransomware and nation state attacks and those kinds of things.
Right, and it's very easy to throw out examples of things that should be caught. It's very easy for the various vendors offering solutions in this space to demo this in a lab environment that they control. It's a lot more difficult to deploy this in a way that actually provides meaningful results in a large corporate environment where there's so much noise, so many different events, no two users are exactly alike. So that's the real challenge, is getting these solutions smart enough to be able to have the real concerning events rise above the noise level.
So Sean, back to the kill chain. In summary, what do you want people to most take away from this talk?
I'd say it's two related items. And the first is recognizing that there are a lot of additional steps that an adversary needs to go through even once they have access to the internal network. And so if we can understand those steps, then we can understand how to implement controls to slow them down and detect them going through those stages. And then the second related item is that we don't need to admit defeat simply because someone got onto the internal network. It's not game over when the adversary gets to stage 7, actions on objectives, because that will take the adversary some significant period of time in the presence of a well-architected environment and a robust security architecture and that defense in depth posture. It will take them some significant amount of time to go through that process. And so by understanding how this all works together and this more complete expanded cyber kill chain model, the defending team is able to adjust their mindset and the architecture and the controls that they have in place to really decrease the risk of a truly materially damaging breach of their organization as far as possible.
Nice. Yeah, that's that's definitely a very, it's a good lesson to learn, especially from your talk. I wish that more people had had a chance to see your talk. So,
well, no worries. So they are actually able to see the slides from the presentation at least.
Okay.
Those are available on my website at www.seantmalone.com. That's SeanTmalone.com.
Nice. Okay.
There's a link right there at the top that says, hey, if you're looking for the expanded cyber kill chain, here it is.
Very nice. We'll put that link also in our show notes. So, Sean, also, how would people want to get a hold of you if they wanted to outside of the podcast here or on your website? Is there other ways of doing that?
Certainly. So they can reach out to me via email. It's sean@seantmalone.com. That email address is also on my website, or they can shout out on Twitter. It's @SeanTMalone.
Okay, so the T is like Tiberius or something like that, like Sean Tiberius.
Not quite that cool. It's Thomas.
Okay, all right.
But you see, when SeanMalone.com is already taken, you want to sort of use that consistent username across the different platforms.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So, do you develop software yourself? Do you have a GitHub or anything like that where people might be able to use your tools, or is that all just trade secret?
So I have some things that are out on GitHub as well, and I actually have a project section of my website with links to that. I actually had a past DEF CON presentation on building a JavaScript botnet and using it as a distributed storage infrastructure to essentially store files in the web data cache on the computers of people visiting a given website.
Very nice. Okay. And people can search for that. Is it Sean T. Malone as well, or is it?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, Mr. Betcher, how would people get a hold of you if they wanted to discuss with you Blue Team related items or more kill chain stuff themselves?
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter. You can IM me at Betcherpwned, BOETTCHERPWNED.
You're going to get a shorter Twitter handle soon, right?
Yeah, I'm still talking to the guy that's at Dot.
Oh, yeah, that one would be impressive if you could get that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the official Breaksec Twitter handle is at Breaksec, BRAKESEC. You can follow me, Brian Brake, at my name, Brian Brake, at Brian, BRYANBRAKE. We just recently did our write-up for our DerbyCon CTF. We raised over $1,000 for Hackers for Charity, which I thought was pretty awesome. We only got 650, I think, last year, so we definitely made some strides in helping Hackers for Charity. We have a Patreon. If you find value in Sean's talk today on the podcast or any of our other shows, you might think about leaving us a little something in the tip jar. Or you can donate as much as little as $1 or as much as, I don't know, sky's the limit. You can do $200, I guess, per episode if you wanted to. Don't do $200 an episode. That would be crazy. But we appreciate that. That would go to helping us with hosting costs and just basically time that I spend editing my gaffes on the podcast. So that'll always be welcome. And we donate most of it or all of it, like we did last year, to Hackers for Charity anyway. So if we don't use any of that money, then it goes to Hackers for Charity. So we're on Facebook. We're on we have a Tumblr. We have a LinkedIn group. We're pretty active on Twitter. So if you want to ask questions or comments or anything like that, we're also on email, bds.podcast@gmail.com. So you can hit us up there. We have an RSS feed. We're on iTunes, Google Play Store. There's pretty much no place you can't find the podcast. And feel free to tell your friends, especially if they're looking for CPEs for things like ISC squared. Podcast 1 hour equals one CPE. So there's always something to think about. Sean, thank you for coming on. I'm glad your talk didn't get fully accepted everywhere. Is that a good thing?
That'll work.
Okay. Well, I hope that people will listen to this and have your talk elsewhere. Are you going to be speaking anywhere in the near future? Are you going to be at DerbyCon, for instance?
Not at DerbyCon.
Okay.
I do have this submitted to a number of additional conferences, but none that I've heard back from yet.
Okay. Well, I hope they hear this and actually have you on, or I don't know. Would having you on the podcast actually make acceptance worse? I'm not sure. I'm still new at this whole rejected talks thing.
If anything, I'm happy to be able to share the topic with a broader audience through the podcast.
Fantastic.
I don't think it would have that much impact one way or another on the conference acceptance.
Okay. Okay. And plus, you're always modifying and updating it, so I'm sure there's other things you can add to
That's
it.
right.
So, yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you again, Sean. If you have another topic, that not necessarily a talk or anything you'd like to come on and discuss, that would be great. I'm gonna give a plug out there. If you guys are looking for pen testers, sounds like Sean's company over there at I forget the name. Damn it, that's another guy. It's, FusionX. There it is. I was waiting for the damn slides to load. But yeah, if you guys are looking for pen testing stuff, sounds like Sean and them got something great going on over there at FusionX. So
and particularly for any individuals and corporations looking to really go beyond typical penetration testing and more into that realm of true adversary simulation engagements.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want to go to the nth level with your pen tests, I would imagine you'd have to have you don't have to have a real big reason to, but I mean it's definitely hit them up and go through that, because I'm sure it'll be for the benefit of everybody involved. So everybody will have a great learning experience. So, all right. Well, that was it for this week's Breaking Down Security. I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
And we're clear. Okay. Well, that was rough. I got the rambling there at the end. I'm sorry. So many gaffes.
It was great.
That was awesome, though. I mean, we went long, but that's fine. I figure with these talks, you're allowed an hour plus, or 50 minutes plus questions. We tend to, ask some questions that may not be necessarily on topic during the show. So, but yeah, that was great. I love the kill chain stuff. Especially the OODA loop, because you were talking about the adversary stuff, and I was like, well, how does one observe being observed? And doesn't Heisenberg says when you observe something, you change its state anyway. So if you're being observed, would you not change how you're being, what you're doing anyway to, or maybe you would like, well, they're watching me doing this, I probably need to not go on this. So you may be able to break their OODA loop a lot sooner, I guess, if you're observing them, observing you.
Right. And on our side, most of the time we simply operate under the assumption that we're being watched. Not necessarily that the blue team knows we have compromised this user account and are on this system. Mm-hmm. But if we assume that they have just about any control in place and that they're watching whatever we do, or they're watching for the types of things that we might try. Yeah. We try to bring that level of care and stealth to our operations.
Yeah.
And then even if we are detected, then it becomes a sparring match in the sense that when we have 5 points of presence, and so even when a detection occurs, the blue team is still not told that it's a drill.
Yeah.
So they treat it as a real incident up to the point where they could bring in law enforcement or start shutting off systems. At that point, we say, okay, end the exercise and we'll debrief. Yeah. But at that point, we've had cases where a detection occurs and the blue team finds if maybe they detected one system, they look into the incident and find 2 more and pull all of those offline, and they declare success, write up their incident report, and they're done. On our side, they missed 2 or 3 additional systems, which may be using completely different C2 methodologies, completely different external infrastructure that it's phoning home to. So that was missed by the net.
Yeah.
So we'll go dark for a few days, a week, wait for things to calm down, and then pick up and continue from that point forward.
Do you use low hanging fruit, like say Meterpreter or something, to give them like the false sense of, hey, we got it, we figured it out, and then you're sitting over here with your own custom made stuff, keeping a bulkhead because they assumed, oh, we found the Meterpreter stuff, it's cool, we don't have to look anywhere else.
Sometimes, okay. Yep. And then in addition to that, we will make things as hard as possible for them to reverse engineer. And for them to trace back. So once we have that persistent access to a given host, our first objective in moving laterally is usually to compromise systems that we can use as tunnel points. So if we can find switches on the network with default credentials, that lets us then SSH to that switch and tunnel everything through that SSH channel, and then go from there to the next stage, and so on. And as we go along, we're modifying logs and such on these devices so that the commands are not showing up in the history there. And this then lets us develop tiers of compromised devices. So tier 0 would be our initial point of access. Tier 1 is anything we access from that compromise point, and then tier 2 and so on. So usually we'll have at least 2 protective tiers in place before we actually go out and start attempting to compromise additional systems or connecting to target systems.
Yeah.
So anything that's riskier is done through those additional layers of obfuscation. And when we get an inkling, when we're observing the observation, we see something's changing here. The behavior of this system has changed. I can no longer log in. Somebody logged into RDP while I was logged in, and they might have seen something that I did. Whatever it is, we'll then burn a few layers back. We'll say, okay, we're logging out here. We're never going to use this system again. And that means that the responding team then needs to trace us back through those multiple hops, which, unless they're logging all network traffic, is usually very difficult to do.
What methods of persistence on Windows hosts do you prefer or use most?
He's just asking for a friend.
Right. No. It varies depending on the controls that are in place.
Do you install a service? Do you just stick to run keys, or?
So usually it's not run keys. Sometimes it'll be. Sometimes we'll have some form of hidden scheduled task. Sometimes it will be something as simple as creating a wrapper for a binary that is executed on a fairly regular basis, such as Microsoft Word or something like that, where the program actually runs, but it also launches our
DLL
process. And there are also some tricks with the different widgets in Windows 8 and so on, and further the desktop widgets that get loaded at boot, and just all sorts of different areas. Basically, anything that's going to run on a regular basis is something that we may try to inject into.
Cool.
So, like a side loading, DLLs or whatnot?
Yep.
Okay.
Cool.
Widgets. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
So what kind of reports do you give to your clients? Like, when it's all said and done, you just like barf everything and say, here's how we did it?
So we have our reports, and then we have the sort of briefings separate from that. And the reports have the detailed technical findings, a compromise narrative of everything that we did to go from point 0 to full compromise, and then sort of the high-level summary and recommendations. And our findings and recommendations have sort of 3 types. There's the technical findings, which are exactly what you would expect. This system has a weak password. This system is missing a patch. Here's a web application vulnerability. But then we'll also have the architectural findings, which are deficiencies noted in the security architecture that are never going to turn up on a vulnerability scanner. So things like, this system could really use 2-factor authentication given its overall value. Or these systems should not be accessible from this area of the network. or this database should have a higher level of encryption given the data that's contained in it. So those types of things. And then also programmatic findings, which are what are the areas for growth in your security program as a whole that we've observed. So if we see a large number of missing patches missing critical security patches that are older than 90 days, that's an indicator not just to go fix those, but also take a look at the vulnerability management program and say, what's going on here? Something's not working right. Or there may be findings in that area around user education or the detection and response process, just whatever it is that we observed about areas where the program can be more effective.
Yep.
And then other than the reports, we'll also sit down with the executive team and do an executive briefing, but then also with the technical team, with the blue team responsible for catching us, regardless of whether or not they did, and walk through step by step. Here's what we did, so that they can start to see things more from the adversary's mindset as well.
Yeah, you're offering suggestions to fix it and that kind of stuff. It's always helpful,
Right, and often it gets very granular, and sometimes we're sitting shoulder to shoulder looking at the tools that they have. And so we were on this system. If you look specifically on this system, what flagged in your tools? And if something didn't flag, does that mean you weren't getting the right data? Or that it wasn't triaged properly with the correct severity? Or sometimes there was an alert, but there wasn't the right training and skill sets in place in terms of the people looking at that alert to know its implications. I mean, we've seen cases where someone got an alert from semantic endpoint protection saying, we found badness on an internal application server, but it's been quarantined. And they saw quarantined and closed the ticket as resolved.
Well, it's okay because it's good.
Right.
Yeah.
So we came back 10 minutes later with a differently obfuscated payload and successfully compromised that system and used it as a pivot point into the next stage of the operation.
Yeah.
So instead, they should have looked at that and said, regardless of the fact that this was quarantined, somebody put bad things on this internal server.
Yeah. It's changing the thinking.
Right.
Yeah, it could go on the work ethic of the individual as well. I mean, I've seen a number of people that there's the hard route, which is, hey, let me investigate that. That seems interesting. And then there's the easy route. Oh, it's a false positive.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me get back to my Facebook.
Yeah.
So there's some of that too, I'm sure.
Very cool. Well, I've invited you down to CSEC East, but I know that you have some child processes that keep you from having a nightlife until they get a little older.
I will try to make it down there at some point.
Nah, don't worry about it. I mean, if you make it, it's fine. It's got to be completely organic. If you can make it, fine. If not, that's fine too.
Sure.
I would love to have lunch with you though. If you can ever, steer away from your work environment, your office there to have lunch. We can meet in Redmond, but it's about halfway. There's plenty of places there to eat in RTC. But I was glad that we had you on. I'm glad that your talk didn't get accepted everywhere. It's odd to say, yeah. So, if you've got anything else you'd like to come on and talk about, that'd be great. If you could send me the contact information for your friend about talking about how to keep the bad guys in the, because this would be a good blue team talk for, okay, we found you, haha. We want to steer you. That would be a very mature blue team, obviously, but. If they're in there, go ahead.
It's like searching for the total package. You can't just go, oh, let me block that IP because I see they're coming from there. And so you block it, and then maybe they're coming from a different IP that's not on your list or not in the IPS.
Yeah.
And you never detect them.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, they move through a different tornado.
There's some of that.
Yeah.
You have to be careful of what action you take as a defender.
No, that's cool. And like I said, steering them and doing like Tyler, asking about what Tyler was asking. That's quite an impossible task for some blue teamers. It's just easier to, burn it down and start over instead of learning about what the attackers are trying to do for either ISAC purposes or anything like that.
Well, and even if you can't steer them, to just know with a high degree of confidence, this is where they are. These are the accounts and systems that they've compromised. We're watching these very carefully, and we can see how they're using this infrastructure to access other pieces of infrastructure. We know our environment well enough to know what these accounts can and cannot access. Mm-hmm. So we know if they are one step away from achieving their end objective, which would be very bad for us, or you know what, they're still 10 steps away.
Yeah.
We've got some time here. Let's keep watching and understand as they go through this process so that we can connect as many dots as possible before we actually pull the trigger and look to eject them from our environment.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, guys, I got to get.
Yeah.
So, Sean, it's great to meet you.
Likewise.
Great podcast. You got some great content there. You're well spoken, and I'm glad to have met you. Glad you were on the cast, and maybe we'll see each other in person sometime.
Yep.
Sounds great.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for being so patient with our technical issues. Like I said, it was a new configuration, so I'm sure it'll all work out. Mr. Betcher, thank you for coming on, and I think we have. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. All right.
Very nice.
Good night, gentlemen.
Good night.
Later.
Bye.